Now,
Uh,
I'm assuming you're getting a quantitative component to this too, because it's my understanding that almost all homes will have some mold in them. It's not, you're not going to find a sterile environment. So
that's
it's,
Now that's the reason why you must do the moisture reading to determine if the moisture's up. You follow?
hmm
And then you must do the species because, for example, Aspergillus flavus, although it's found indoors and outdoors, it grows more readily indoors than outdoors in these environments that we've tested. Same thing with versicolor fumigatus. We see them tremendously concentrated indoors versus the outdoor sample. So yes, you're giving that. And then the other thing is the bacteria, particularly the mycobacterium and the streptomyces are important to know.
okay, great. So the first step, of course, is to remediate and stop the water intrusion.
That's another. The first step is stop the water intrusion. Yes.
Right. You got to get that. There's nothing because if you start trying to clean up the environment with the water still coming in, you're just trying to like bailing a ship with a hole in the bottom.
Yes.
It's going to fill right back up.
Well, yeah, and then what if the people have become ill with a variety of symptoms? I've seen people who have developed a condition in which they can't even tolerate odors of various types anymore.
hmm
So what happens is a person can become so sensitive that they cannot even clean up remediate their homes where they can go back into the home and live in that home. So I've seen some very tragic situations from that point of view.
Hmm. Interesting. So, once they've found the water source, which is the number one highest priority, and to make sure that you have a dry home internal environment, what cautions or recommendations would you make to address the cleanup from that point?
Well, the first thing that's recommended is that let's say that you have an infested wall that's in the middle of the home between the living room and let's say the adjoining den.
hmm
What is recommended is that whole area must be walled off from the rest of the house somehow, some way. In other words, you drape it with plastic and you tie the plastic down with masking tape so that that area will not theoretically contaminate the rest of the house.
hmm
You tear into the wall and you remove all materials that are affected by mold growth. In other words, if you see studs that have mold in them, I've seen individuals recommend, well, you sand the surface. Well, you sand the surface, but the hyphae of the mold grow into the wood, and once you sand the surface, and then you add moisture sometime down the road, you add a little moisture to it, the mold will come right back.
Yes,
Because
like
you don't get that the mold is deeply embedded. So I would say just remove everything that you
well,
can.
all organic materials, but what about metals and like the pipe?
Metal you can clean. Metal that can be cleaned properly, okay. But the wood surface, the wall board, the carpeting, that type of material, no, I don't think you can clean it sufficiently to get rid of the mold.
Okay, well, that's a good caution.
Yeah.
And now I actually neglected to mention to ask you for your comment on the identification phase of this process. There are mold sniffing dogs, and I'm wondering if you've had any experience or comments on them to help identify where the problem is.
I haven't used one of them. I really don't have much comment. I think they can train a dog to detect many odors. But my question is what's going to happen with the dog when the dog gets sinus infections? It can no longer sniff. Okay, it can no longer smell. They can use that, but again, I think that the dog cannot replace moisture meters, for example. The moisture meters are the most critical thing that I've seen so far. You have to determine the moisture content, and a dog cannot do that.
Oh, interesting. So rather than have an inspection by a mold sniffing dog, it might be more useful to invest in a water meter detector, moisture detector, and do a very comprehensive evaluation. More so than most inspectors would do, because they're just going to give a superficial thing. And if you've got a superficial scan, but if you want to really go over fine detail every piece of the floor and wall, which may be tedious, but nevertheless really crucial to identify these sources.
Yeah, right. Well, I'll give an example. I think in the opening I mentioned this condominium here in Sacramento, California, that we did a moisture reading of the floor. the moisture reading of the floor where the water was seeping up through the foundation or through the slab was 85 to 90%.
Hmm.
All right. We did the walls, and the walls were 40 and 50%. In other words, the moisture will come up the wall, but if you look right near the baseboard, at about 18 inches up, the water content was in 80%. You get up higher on the wall because the water will only go so far up the wall, correct?
Sure, sure.
You get high up on the wall, and it was normal.
Hmm.
And so people have to be very careful. When I say you do the entire wall, you just start from the top and come on right on down to the baseboard.
Hmm.
Or start from the baseboard and go up to the top. Okay, now I've seen people go in and do moisture meeting, put it on the middle of the wall in a room, and come back with negative results when the problem is at the baseboard.
Hmm. Does it typically, can you find it through the baseboard, or do you have to take the baseboard off?
No, you don't have to take the baseboard out. It'll read it right through the baseboard. Some of these meters are sufficiently are so efficient that they will read deep moisture that are several inches deep.
Wow, that's very good.
But that's the more expensive meters.
Sure.
The other expensive one I mentioned earlier for $87, no. But if you get a very expensive meter, yes, it'll get several inches deep.
Do you have any brands that you recommend, or do you found
No,
that are not
not
particularly?
really offhand.
Okay. But typically, I would imagine the more you spend, the higher quality is going to be.
That is right. That is right. I think what you need to do is if you decide you want to purchase one is you talk with the vendor and find out all the information on the meter, and then also read the description of the meter and what the meter is capable of doing. But you want a meter that has LED readout and that can actually read moisture that's several inches deep.
Going back to the remediation, you mentioned walling off or isolating the contaminated area so you don't spread the mold spores. Are there any other cautions that you would advise consumers to use when they're finding a contractor to implement this process, such as the use of
They should have a
HEPA filter?
HEPA filtration machine in there, which trapping the particulate matter. That would be helpful too. You follow?
Sure, sure.
Okay, because when they're cut into these walls, they're going to create all forms of dust.
Mm-hmm.
So they need to then HEPA, and then there are HEPA vacuum cleaners that are available that where they can go and clean off, do a vacuum of all the furniture and nooks and crannies of the room and things of this nature. So they must also clean that up too from that point of view.
So you find that's necessary after the remediation's been done and you've isolated the water sources and done the process to kill the molds to actually do that HEPA vacuum to remove the mold material from the internal environment.
Okay, now I would caution that you mentioned the word kill the mold, okay?
Yeah.
I would caution against directly trying to kill the mold with things like ammonia
Mm-hmm.
and vinegar and
bleach.
What happens is you'll kill the mold, but you'll leave the carcass behind.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the carcass will disintegrate and release toxins into the air. So you really traded one problem from mold growth to another problem, dead mold and the release of all of their toxins.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a practice that I've heard say, well, just use bleach and kill them. Well, bleach will only do a surface killing. That will leave behind the carcass of the mold, okay, and then once water is reintroduced to the environment, the mold will grow right back through the surface, okay.
Are there any more effective cleaning agents than bleach that you'd advocate?
Well, I advocate using sodium bicarbonate and vinegar. Those are the
Really?
two most non-toxic approaches that you can use.
And those are more effective than bleach?
Well, I think they're just as effective as bleach, if not more so.
And they're not toxic, of course.
Right.
Okay, well that's a good component.
Use the white vinegar because the colored vinegar will leave a stain behind.
Okay, well that's a pretty good pearl. I like that one. So after and this would be primarily to reinforce this point, to clean the metal surfaces. Any of the wood or paper materials really should be replaced if they have mold contamination, because it's just you're not going to be able to clean it as deep as you need to.
Right. Well, one of the frequent questions, and when you mention wood, frequent question I get is, can I clean my wood furniture? Well, yes, you can if it's been sealed properly by previous use of like varnish or shellac or thing like that. But if you have a wood furniture that has never been sealed, you may not be able to get that clean. You follow?
Interesting. Yeah, but
Okay.
but fortunately, most furniture does have a finish on it, so it would form a relatively impenetrable barrier. If it's been painted or is a varnish or polyurethane, it's not going to be the mold's not going to be able to penetrate that. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
All right.
Okay.
So, but if it's open, exposed, bare wood, then you've got an issue, and you may have to actually sounds like destroy that or remove it from your home.
That's right. Yeah, that's what I'd recommend anyway. Cleaning up the indoor or outdoor air is a very difficult job. The best thing to use are HEPA filters, multi-stage filtration apparatus that contains HEPA filters and carbon absorption materials. But the problem there is that now you have to maintain that system because
Hmm.
you're going to create a problem within the filtration system itself.
Hmm.
I'll give you an example. We went to Bermuda to look at these buildings, and they had put HEPA filters, multi-stage HEPA filters in the building. We opened them up, and they had never maintained the HEPA filters or anything. And the machines were loaded with microbial growth, both bacteria and mold.
Hmm.
And we isolated out of those machines a very potential serious human pathogen called Bacillus cereus.
Hmm.
Okay, and Bacillus cereus is known to cause severe food poisoning. Okay, now if it's in the filtration machine, it would have to be in the air, correct?
Absolutely.
I don't know how to question because that's a difficult one. If you want to use a filtration apparatus, you will have to make sure you maintain it. For example, I went into a home here in Folsom, California, where it had mold and bacterial growth, and I walked into the home and the people were using portable air filters, and I looked at the filtration media in the filters, and they were plugged. It's just horrible,
Hmm.
goofy. I took those filters and took them down and had them cultured, and guess what? I found the bacteria and the mold in the filters, so therefore all they were doing is recycling.
Recycling and then paying money to do it, electricity and such. So not a wise approach. So if you're going to use HEPA filters, and make sure the strong recommendation is to make sure they're well maintained. Otherwise, you may be making the problem worse.
That's right, right. And the other thing too is people ask me how do I reduce the humidity? Well, you could use dehumidifiers, but if you use a dehumidifier in the indoor environment, you have to make sure you maintain that so that you don't get mold growth growing in the condensation pan of the dehumidifier. You follow?
Sure. Unless it goes directly to a drain, I would guess, which
That's
some
right,
do.
right.
Yeah. So that's another good caution.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm just still wondering if you have any good recommendations for the person who identifies a mold growth source, remediates it, and does some air quality samples and find there's still levels of mold. Would you recommend these HEPA vacuuming systems, or just scrubbing everything down with baking soda and vinegar?
Yeah,
Or
well, you can scrub the hard furniture, like we mentioned earlier, with vinegar and baking soda, and then vacuum the entire house with a HEPA filter. Uh, those would be the only precautions that are available to us today.
okay, that's good to know. And what type of concentrations of the uh, vinegar and the baking soda? Would it be a few tablespoons of each to a quart of water, or what have you found to be useful?